Okay, thank you for joining our webinar. My name is Jonica Horton. I'm the VP of Marketing at Sandia Area Federal Credit Union. Now, I would like to introduce you to our presenter. Rachel Lund is the VP of Compliance and Risk at Sandia Area. She is a nationally certified risk manager who uses cybersecurity expertise to reduce risk at the credit union and train staff about how to help protect members from fraud. Rachel's been with Sandia for 16 years, and she is a graduate from the University of Arkansas. In her free time, Rachel loves to hike, bike, and swim with her family. She's also an avid reader. All attendees are on mute. If you have a question or technical difficulty, please use the Q&A feature, and we will address as many questions as we can at the end of the session. If there are questions that go unanswered, we'll reach out to you individually. Now let's get started.
Thanks so much, Jonica. I'm glad to be here tonight. I'm glad so many of you are joining us tonight. And I'm glad to be talking about cybersecurity. It's something that's very important to all of us because we all engage with our devices. We're all online, so it's important that we try to stay safe when we're online. This is just an overview of some of the topics we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about device security. We're going to talk about authentication and passwords, ransomware, social engineering, and maybe a little bit about social media. So let's dive right into device security. A few of the things that are important to remember when we're talking about our device security is to keep current with all of the updates that are available for your device. Usually you get a notification that there's an update available, and you should always stay up to date on those. Usually what happens with those is people have detected some vulnerabilities, and the updates are designed to close those holes, those vulnerabilities. So it's important to keep up to date. Another thing is to disable Bluetooth when it's not in use. Bluetooth can be hacked. Someone can hack into your device through your Bluetooth vector. Another important thing is to vet apps before you install them. So one thing that's happening is a lot of lookalike apps are springing up to make you think it's your favorite retailer or another app that you want to download. And really it's just designed to capture your information and steal it. So make sure you read user reviews. It's important that there's a lot of user reviews for an app that's well known. If you're going to download Instagram, for example, you're going to expect there to be more than 67 reviews of Instagram, and not so much if it's a lookalike app. And also make sure that people are rating it pretty high. You don't want to download an app that doesn't have a very good rating. Also, never load an app from a link. Those can sometimes come in phishing emails where people are just trying to get you to click on a malicious link. And just remember that retail and gaming apps are the most prone to be spoofed because those are the ones that capture your credit card details. Webcams is another thing that you might want to think about keeping more secure. They have little covers that you can put on your laptop webcam to keep that closed so that if someone were to hack into it, they couldn't spy on you. Public Wi-Fi is an interesting to think about. When you're using public Wi-Fi, other people are also using public Wi-Fi. So it's not always wise to do, your online banking transactions or put your credit card details in if you're using public Wi-Fi. And one of the important things too that I think we're going to hit on a couple of times tonight is to save backups. Once you've backed up everything on your device, if it does get hacked, at least you have that information or pictures or documents or whatever you're storing that's important to you. And now we have a polling question.
Yes, so when it comes up to device updates, let's launch this here. Y'all can vote here. Do you load them when my device tells me? And they're, I hope everyone, and they're available. I don't know, I don't want to load them. What if there are glitches? I don't want any updates, and I've been ignoring them since 2015. So Looks like our voters are coming in. We'll give it like 1 or 2 more minutes. Looks like number 1. I load them when my device tells me. Oh, and I've been ignoring them. A couple come in a little bit later. But Rachel, what's our end device advice here?
Yeah, my advice is definitely to load them when your device tells you they're available, because again, those are, things, vulnerabilities that they're trying to close. They're trying to keep you more safe by putting out those updates. So I think that's a best practice for sure.
Okay.
And I'm glad to see that the majority of people chose that option.
Well, we have a lot of smart members.
Yeah, that's true. And I do think it's important on that second option to remember that usually those apps or those updates have already been tested. And so we shouldn't worry too much about whether or not there are glitches in the updates because those have been tested before they've been pushed out to you. So awesome. So the next thing we'll talk about is authentication and passwords. And this is super important. If your apps and your device know who you are, they will let you get into your accounts and get into your devices. And sometimes that can be forged. So the one thing that is increasing in popularity is the use of multi-factor authentication, which basically means you have to have more than one factor in order to log in. So multi-factor authentication uses 2 of those 3 bullet points in the middle there. So something you know, something you have, or something you are. And in the something you know category, that could be things like passwords, passcodes, and PINs. It could also be security questions. A lot of websites and apps that you log into will ask you security questions that you set up when you first initiated that account. Something you have, that could be a token, a badge, a key fob. That could also be something like a dedicated device that's dedicated to that particular system. Sometimes we see that in workplaces. And something you are is generally referring to biometrics like your fingerprints. Sometimes they do a retina scan, a voice recognition scan, or facial recognition. So using 2 out of 3 of those is called multi-factor authentication or 2-factor authentication. Sometimes multi-factor authentication will send one-time passwords. So that's when you're logging in and the application will text or email you a one-time password that you can use for just that login. And one of the things that our VP of IT was talking to me about earlier this week is that sometimes the SMS providers, which is texting, have been hacked in the past. So the most secure way of doing one-time passwords is through email or a telephone call and not texts. So that's an interesting tip that I got from him. The other important thing to remember in authentication is to use stronger passwords. Passwords aren't always that secure, but the stronger your password, the better off you're going to be. So we have some tips about strengthening passwords. And this first list is things that you should do. So your password should include numbers, symbols, uppercase and lowercase. If all you do is use, lowercase letters, it's more hackable than if you use a lot of different kinds of characters in your password or passcode. The next thing is to use passphrases or passcodes. So that's something more complicated than a password. If you use dictionary words, that's also more hackable. So something that's in code, something that's more of a phrase than a word, can be stronger. Another important thing is to make them strong and memorable. If it's a strong password with all kinds of numbers and symbols and things like that, but you can never remember it, it's not a very effective password. You're going to want to make sure it's something that's memorable to you. And then the other thing is to make sure you log off of shared devices. So if you log into the computer in the library, or if you're going to school and you log into a computer lab computer or something like that, make sure you're logging off of all of your apps that you've opened so that you're not leaving it open for the next person to come along. And here are a few don'ts when it comes to passwords. So like I said before, don't include dictionary words. Those are very hackable. Don't use keyboard sequences. So if you look at your keyboard and there's a bunch of letters in order like ASDFG, that's not a very good password. That's also pretty hackable. You should also not share passwords. Passwords are unique to you, and that's what keeps you secure and your account secure, the fact that it's unique to you and only you can log in. Don't use the same password for everything, because once it's hacked on one app, it could potentially be hacked on all of the other places you've used that password. Don't let anyone watch you type passwords in. So this is called shoulder surfing. If someone's over your shoulder and looking at you type your password, people are really skilled. I don't think I could ever do that, watch someone type their password into a keyboard and then recreate it later, but there are a lot of people who have honed that skill so that they can steal passwords. And then the last thing here is just don't save passwords on shared devices. So, we talked about if you're in a computer lab or if you're logging in at the library, those are shared devices. And sometimes when you log into apps, they'll ask you if you want to save your password for that app so that you don't have to put it in manually next time. Don't ever do that on shared devices. It's kind of not recommended even on devices that are dedicated to you, but definitely don't do that on shared devices. This chart kind of shows how you can do whatever password you want in a little bit stronger way. So the one that I like on here the best is toward the bottom. I love my piano. So changing that I to an exclamation point, you can still remember that. That's enough of an I, enough like an I, that you can still remember it. And then adding some capitalization. That's a little bit better than just the all lowercase I love my piano. But a stronger password that you can still remember also changes the E to a 3 and then the I to a 1. So those are some ways that you can strengthen your passwords but keep them memorable. This is a chart that our marketing manager sent me, and I think it's really interesting. It shows how quickly your password can be hacked based on what it's made up of. So if it's numbers only, it can be hacked instantly up to 8 characters. And if it's numbers only and 13 characters, it only takes a hacker 11 hours to hack that. So this is just kind of an interesting chart, an interesting thought experiment about how strong your passwords are, how long it would take a hacker to, to hack those passwords. And, you can see kind of in the bottom right-hand side, some of them are like 1 billion years or 6 trillion years or something like that. So strong passwords definitely make a difference. And talking about passcodes, this is just an interesting way of doing it, an interesting way of making sure that it's something you're not going to forget, but it's something that's way less hackable. So if you take that sentence, the first house I ever lived in was 601 Lake Street. Rent was $800 per month. I guess that's 2 sentences. That's biographical information about you. Obviously that's not about you, but you could make it about you and then turn that into a passcode. So it's not a word, but it's something that's memorable and strong. So if you look at that line down there that looks pretty nonsensical, while I read the sentence again, you can see how it's a strong password. The first house I ever lived in was 601 Lake Street. Rent was $800 per month. So that's one way of making sure that you have a strong passcode that you can remember later. And then I just had to put the BBC Sherlock reference up there too, where the BBC was trying to educate about strong passwords. The next thing we want to talk about is ransomware. And I'm sure ransomware is something that you've been hearing about because it's increasingly happening. And basically what ransomware does is it breaches a device or a network and locks or encrypts that information and then demands a ransom in order to decrypt it. So these attacks are increasingly sophisticated. They have the capability to export the information prior to encryption. So that means criminals already have your information before they've encrypted it. People and organizations are vulnerable through phishing and malicious websites. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. And then device and software vulnerabilities. These are the types of vulnerabilities that those device updates are meant to mediate. So that's another reason that you should always load those updates as soon as they're available. There have been a few pretty high profile ransomware cases this year. I'm just going to mention a couple, just some that have happened in 2021. If we went back farther than that, there's just a whole ton to choose from. But there was an attack earlier this year in April. The NBA, one of their teams, the Houston Rockets, had a ransomware attack, and the criminals stole some information there. In May of this year, the Colonial Pipeline was shut down for a time because they were the victims of a ransomware attack, and that caused some gas shortages, especially on the eastern coast of the United States. There was also a meat packing company in May of this year, JBS, that they produce about 1/4 of the United States' beef, and they paid about $11 million in ransom. So it's definitely something that is increasing, and it's affecting a lot of industries, a lot of different industries. So when criminals demand a ransom in order to decrypt your files, they usually make that demand in cryptocurrency. And that's interesting too. A lot of people don't have access to cryptocurrency. They don't know how to access cryptocurrency. So that's difficult for them to comply with. There's also no guarantee the criminal will follow through with the decryption. Like we talked about on the previous slide, they have exported the information before they've encrypted it. And so when they're in possession of the information, they can do whatever they want with it. They could still release it, even if the ransom is paid. And even if they say they're going to decrypt, they may not decrypt. Criminals could also increase the ransom, whether or not it's paid on time. And some interesting statistics, 92% of organizations don't get all of their data back. 29% couldn't recover more than half. So that's pretty terrible. And then 80% suffered a repeat attack. Because the criminals are already in possession of your information, they could repeat the attack again. And then these other facts are interesting too, that sometimes it takes an average of 197 days to identify a breach, 69 days to contain it, and the average attack costs $1.85 million. So a couple of things when it comes to ransomware that we can do. The first one is backing up your information. If you have it backed up, then when the ransomware comes and encrypts it, it's not as catastrophic, and it can be restored after the attack. The next thing is education and awareness. So one of the primary vectors for ransomware is phishing, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. And just other education, like we're talking about tonight, things that you can do to prevent ransomware. There's also filtering software, spam filters that can keep phishing emails from even coming through. And then making sure you keep your devices up to date. Again, something that we're going to hit on a few times because it's so important. Make sure your software is the most recent version, and make sure you're patching it as those patches are available. And I think it's time for another polling question.
Yeah, so ransomware is a threat. Let's look at these answers and see how people do. These are the results for the last one. Stop sharing, go to the next one. Oh, there we go. Number one, I never worry about it. Number two, I worry about it when there's a high profile attack. Number three, I increasingly worry about it. And number four, I'll worry about it after tonight. So we have a couple votes in here. Let's see. We'll give it another couple seconds, maybe half a minute. All right. I'll end the poll and show the results. So half the people said, oh, worry about it after tonight.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think one of the things to worry about isn't necessarily that you'll personally be ransomed, but that any number of businesses that you do business with might experience it. Like that Colonial Pipeline was kind of a big deal earlier this year, and the meat packing company, that could definitely affect supply chain for things that we depend on. Right. So the next thing we're going to talk about is social engineering. Basically what social engineering is where criminals try to deceive you and manipulate you into giving up confidential information or personal information that they can then use for fraudulent purposes. And the three most common kind of umbrella types of social engineering are smishing, phishing, and impersonation. We're not really going to talk about impersonation tonight because it's not necessarily a cyber threat, but that's where someone can impersonate an authority figure or someone from like a repair company, try to gain access physically to your home or to your business, or try to gain access just to information through impersonation. But we will talk about smishing and phishing. Before we get into the specifics, there are some scams that have popped up over the past year, a year and a half, I guess now, that are specific to COVID. And one thing to remember is that criminals will always take advantage of disasters or something that keeps people vulnerable or makes us on edge or something we maybe need more information about. So criminals will definitely take advantage of those situations, and COVID has been a huge situation like that. The statistic to the right there, since the beginning of the pandemic, consumers have paid over $585.5 million just in COVID-related schemes. So that's not even a reflection of how many people were targeted but were not the victims of those schemes. These are just extremely increasing and rampant. And they take place in several different categories. So medical is pretty obvious, you know, it's a virus. And so they're trying to take advantage of our need for both information and supplies. I've seen scams out there that target testing and vaccines, contact tracing, some of them even proposing fake remedies for COVID. The next category is supply chain. So remember when we were all worried about where can we buy toilet paper? Some of the scams have kind of taken advantage of that and offered to send masks or sanitizer or things like that that might be in short supply. So they're taking advantage of our need for those types of things. The next one is online shopping. And a lot of us have done a lot more online shopping during COVID than we otherwise would have. So the criminals are taking advantage of that as well. Some of the scams have also come through either unemployment benefits, which a lot of people relied on during COVID, have relied on during COVID, and then also the stimulus check benefits. There have been a lot of scams out there that have been targeting that and making people think they can get their stimulus check faster or in a different way. And then unfortunately, there has been a surge in charity scams. One of the things to remember is that you can always look up on the FTC website whether a charity is legitimate or not before you donate to them. But definitely criminals will always try and get us to donate to their fictitious charity because they know that we care and we don't want people to be suffering. And we know that COVID has affected a lot of people. So this is just a reminder that when something like COVID happens, or if there's a disaster, those criminals are going to try and appeal to you wanting to help. If it's the hurricane victims or flood victims or something like that, definitely be wary of unsolicited solicitations for donations like that. Make sure that you're vetting the charities through the FTC or another reliable source. So we'll talk a little bit about smishing. Smishing is the same thing as phishing, if you've heard of phishing through email, except it's through text. And usually it contains malicious links. You can see this example that I included here. This one actually came to our Vice President of IT. So that was his address there that I grayed out for you, which means the criminals know his address. So you might be tempted to think that it's very convincing. You might be tempted to fall for it if they know things about you, like they know obviously your phone number because they're texting you. And in this case, they also knew this person's address and they're sending a link. This particular one is just a vague government program that he may qualify for. So clicking on that link could load malicious software to your device. Definitely don't do that. But what you should also not do is reply stop or help like it asks you to do at the bottom. If you do that, the criminals know it's a legitimate number and will continue to target you. So this sort of communication is just as risky as if it were an email. We talk about phishing a lot because that's something criminals use a lot, but smishing is also pretty risky. Any reply will tell them that it's an active number. They might be looking for you to reply, not in this case, but in other examples with confidential information. They might be saying, please reply to this text with your name and address and we'll send you, whatever it is they're promising. The thing to remember about social engineering, whether it's smishing or phishing, is that the criminals will try to prey on your emotions. They'll try to develop a sense of urgency, making you feel like you have to act now. They may try to prey on your sympathies, again, like those charity scams, or they may make you feel like your accounts are in some sort of danger and you need to reset your password. So make sure that if something seems like it's generating an emotion in you, that you become a little bit suspicious of that, because that's what criminals want. They want you to have an emotional reaction and do what they're asking you to do. So I have a few smishing examples that are COVID specific. Like we were talking about, the criminals really like to use a disaster or some sort of current event to prey on us. So this one says, due to the recent shortage of face masks, the Red Cross will be distributing 1 free box per household. Visit this link to get one. And this is a Canadian example, so that's why it's .ca, and that's why the message is in French instead of in English there above the message. So this isn't an example of something that happened in the US, but it very well could have. Some people might have received a text like this, and the link looks legitimate, but it's probably not. It's definitely a scam. So don't fall for that sort of thing. That's too good to be true. That's another thing criminals like to do, make things look too good to be true. If it probably is too good to be true because it's not true. The next one, this is a text that someone received that says, someone who came into contact with you tested positive or has shown symptoms for COVID-19 and recommends you self-isolate and get tested. And then they give you a link for more information. So if I got this text, I'd probably be thinking, well, who was I in contact with that tested positive or has symptoms of COVID? And these types of texts were a lot more popular a little bit earlier in the pandemic. I think now we just assume, that we've been in contact with a lot of different people who may have tested positive, but these texts are definitely geared toward people who, might react to that, might be interested to know more information. Who was I exposed to? Things like that. So they definitely prey on our emotions and make us very curious to know more information. And then the other example, so in this example, the criminals know the person's first name. And it says, Caitlin, we've been attempting to get your stimulus check to you, but it's being returned. Verify your information here. So if I'm Caitlin, I definitely don't want to miss out on my stimulus check. But also, if I'm Caitlin, I am definitely not clicking on that link because it's probably malicious, a malicious link that's going to load some bad software onto my phone. But these are just some examples of how tricky it gets. The criminals definitely know how to push our various buttons and make us want to do what they're asking us to do. So that's why education like this is important, to know what's out there, to know what the criminals are doing so that we can not fall victim to that. So the other type of social engineering that we'll talk about is phishing. And it's very similar to smishing, like we've just been talking about, except it's over email. So usually a phishing email will have a link or an attachment or a request for information, because that is how criminals do their work. The links and attachments can load malicious software onto your device. And sometimes that's ransomware, sometimes it's Trojan horses, sometimes it's just different viruses that they can get into your systems and infect them. Sometimes it will be a request for information. They're phishing for information so that they can use that information in a future attack. The more information they gather, the more they can use in the future to make you think that they have a lot of information on you. In past information breaches, criminals have gotten a lot of information. So sometimes when they come at you with information, you shouldn't automatically then think it's a legitimate person contacting you. It can sometimes be criminals who do have your information from previous breaches. One of the main things that you should do, this is what I train our staff here at the credit union to do, is to hover over a link. And if you do that, a little box will pop up that tells you where that link is going to take you. So make sure you're verifying those links before you click on them. If they are shortened links, you can verify them at certain websites like this one that I posted here, checkshorturl.com. Make sure that you are hovering over those links so that you know exactly where they'll take you before you click on them. If you are online and you want to click on a link, you can do the same thing. If you hover over the link, it usually pops up in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen where that link will take you, so you can make sure you're verifying it before you click on it. One of the things to look for is spelling errors or bad grammar. A lot of times hackers are not native English speakers, so sometimes that comes through when they're writing these emails. Sometimes they spell things wrong. Sometimes it's grammatically just not right. So that should definitely be a red flag to you that email might not be legitimate. Make sure you're looking at who the email is actually from. You can make your email look like it's from anyone. It can look like it's from your mom. It can look like it's from your boss. But if you look at the actual email address, that's more reliable than just the display name that comes up. So make sure it's a recognizable email address it's coming from. Again, these criminals use manipulation. So that could be urgency or fear, sympathy, curiosity. Sometimes, like I said, it's offers that are too good to be true. Definitely be suspicious of all of those things. So some of the popular, prominent examples in the past of phishing emails are LinkedIn requests. That one was going around for a lot of years, and I've seen it pop up again, where so-and-so wants to add you to their LinkedIn network. You may or may not know that person, but that's definitely a common phishing email. There's also a lot of social media notifications that go around. So for example, your friend just tagged you in a picture, click here to see it. Or, something like, you have updates on Instagram, click here to see them, things like that. And then another popular one is just password reset notifications. So these come in and sometimes they say, your Google account might have been breached. Click here to change your password. And in the case of those, it's always the best with all three of those examples to go to those websites or apps through the way that you would normally go there. So don't click on the link in the email. Don't ever do that. Just open up the app or open up the website where you would normally access it and make sure that everything is right when you log in there. So I did post over here on the right an example of a phishing email. In this case, they did have someone's name, which I blurred out there. And then it says, please find attached COVID-19 new preventive measures. You have just received a document in Excel format from the below email. And then there's some, COVID statistics there. There have been so many confirmed cases, including this many deaths. So obviously they're trying to capitalize on our curiosity about what's happening with COVID. They're trying to make us open the attachment because it says they're new preventive measures. But if you notice, there's like a little bit of a grammatical weirdness in that first sentence. Please find attached COVID-19 new preventive measures. That's not really a sentence structure most native English speakers would use. So there is something a little bit fishy about that. If it's an email that you're not expecting, definitely also be suspicious. And then the other example I have is from the movie Black Widow. So this is an interesting one because I think it had a release date before COVID, and then they changed the release date maybe twice over the last year and a half. And so this is another way criminals use some kind of current event or something that's going on in order to make us give them our information. So this one's asking for a lot of personal information. Actually, they want us to want to see the movie because we feel like we've waited to see it or something like that. And they're asking for a lot of information: first name, last name, zip code, and then they're actually asking for card information. So this is a pretty tricky one, and it's one that a lot of people did fall for because, there was a lot of delay of this particular movie and then a lot of curiosity about it. And so the criminals capitalized on that. One other thing that's important, not specific to phishing, but for online security, is to not let your browser store your credit card information. That's another way that criminals can get our information, is if we allow certain websites to store it. So when it asks you if you want it to remember, you want the browser to remember your credit card information, you should definitely say no. Sometimes criminals come up with forms where they just want you to give your name and your email address so they can send you something. But because you've let your browser store it, they can kind of on the back end also get your credit card information if you've told your browser to store that information. So that's another thing to remember, to keep cyber secure, to not let your browser store your credit card information. So that is what I have as far as prepared slides. I think maybe we have some questions. Jonica, are there questions? Let's see. All right, there's a question about, do I recommend password generators? So the way I would answer that question is yes, password generators can help you generate complex passwords that are not hackable. But I would say at the same time to make sure you're storing your password in maybe a password manager or in a secure way, because you're not going to be able to remember those passwords that the password generator generates because they're very complex. So I would say if you're going to use a password generator, make sure that you're also using a password manager to store your passwords in a secure location. Another thing you should not do is store your passwords like on a Post-it note on your computer or in an area where other people could see them, because that's not very password secure.
Yeah. And here's another question. How do I hover over links on my mobile device?
Oh, that's a great question. So, right, when you're on a laptop or a computer, You have a mouse and you can hover over links that way, so that it, like I said, pops up and shows you where it will take you before it takes you there. But it is more complicated on your mobile device. You don't have a mouse. So that's a great question. So if you're on your mobile device, if you just quickly tap on it, that's what will open the link. But if you press and hold your finger on the link, an options box will pop up. So in my email, my Gmail, the options are to either open it in my browser or copy the URL or to share the link. So, and I think some devices also have like an add to reading list option. That didn't show up in my Gmail when I tested it, but so before those options pop up at the top, there's a full web address. So if you press and hold and that options box pops up, it also shows you the full URL where that link will take you. So if your phone has a preview of the site, you can hide the preview to see the full web address for the link. So that's a great question.
Okay, about 3 more questions. If anyone wants to send anything else in, please do. But I'll go with our next one. How can I report a scam?
That's a great question too. So I know the Department of Justice has a National Center for Disaster Fraud hotline. So you can call that phone number, and then they also have a web form. The FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, also has a website where you can report any kind of scam, whether it's a cyber scam or any other kind. And then the FBI also has, this is specific to online scams. They have their Internet Crime Complaint Center, and you can go on there and report an internet crime on that website. So that's a great question too.
Okay, here's another one that just came up. I sometimes get the same emails or texts that look suspicious. Should I just unsubscribe to the emails or reply stop to the text instead of deleting them?
Yeah, that's a tricky one because I've seen examples before where criminals can use the unsubscribe button at the bottom of an email to load malware, just like any other bad link. So you might think you're avoiding the bad links if you didn't click on anything in the body of the email, but clicking on that unsubscribe button or unsubscribe link is just as dangerous, really, as clicking on those phishing links. So you're better off to just delete them, as annoying as that is, because I know what it's like to get those same emails all the time that are suspicious. But I recommend just to delete them. When it comes to texts, I think it's the same thing. We talked about it before.
Mm-hmm.
If you reply to a text, the criminals know that it's an active phone number that's in use, and then they can target you again. So I do think it's better to just delete the text. I think I probably delete like 10 texts a week. So I know exactly the frustration, but it is safer to just delete them.
Okay, and here's one that came up. Where do you find a good password manager app?
That's a great question. I'm not sure. I don't use them that often, so I don't really have any that I recommend, but there are a lot of trade organizations that will have recommendations. So like Wired Magazine, you might go see if they have recommendations, or Symantec or CNET, organizations like that might have some good articles that you could go read, and they would recommend some good password managers. Yeah, I don't really have any that I would recommend, but I do think those sources would be things that I would trust.
Absolutely. And this is one more, and it's about COVID, but so here's a question about contact tracing. I went to a restaurant and they asked my name and phone number to contact me if there was a reported case of COVID-19. Is that legit?
Yeah, it's such a tricky situation, isn't it? Because they are doing that. The state does rely on different businesses and things like that, and employers, for example, to tell them where exposure to COVID has happened. So I do think it's legitimate if your employer or, somewhere you went, like a restaurant, asks you for your phone number. That is the way that they have been contact tracing through the state of New Mexico. So yeah, that's such a tricky one. And I think maybe verifying on the state of New Mexico's website that that's legitimate is a fair thing to do, even though that is how they've been doing contact tracing.
And then we have one last one. Could you recommend a credit record reporting link?
That's not in my expertise. I'm not sure, Jonica, if you think that's something we have linked on our website at the credit union, or?
Yeah, we can look into that and respond back to.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. Right. Well, Rachel, thank you so much. This has been so informative. I'm so happy that I get to work with you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great.
So, if anybody has any other questions, please feel free to email marketing@sandia.org and we'll get back to you. And I hope you have a good evening and stay
Thanks,
safe out
everyone.
there.